In the late autumn of 1944, the Western Front trembled with the belief that the war's end was finally within reach. From Normandy's beaches to the shattered villages of France, the Allied armies had swept aside the German Wehrmacht, driving them back toward their homeland. The Ardennes lay open. The Rhine River glimmered as the last great barrier, and beyond it, Berlin. Yet between the American First Army and that final river crossing stretched a vast brooding forest. Its name was the Hürtgen. It was no ordinary wood. It was a fortress of nature, 140 square kilometers of ancient pines, dark and dense, rolling hills choked with undergrowth, steep ravines, and narrow ridges that twisted like veins through the landscape. The forest straddled the German border southeast of Aachen, the first German city to fall to the Allies. For commanders staring at their maps, it seemed merely a patch of green that needed clearing before the next advance. But to the men who would soon step beneath its canopy, it would become something else entirely. In early September, General Omar Bradley's 12th Army Group pressed eastward, expecting resistance, but not a prolonged nightmare. The Siegfried Line, Germany's western wall of bunkers, pillboxes, and dragon's teeth, ran along the forest's edge. Intelligence reports were thin, suggesting only scattered defences. What the Allies didn't realise was that inside the forest, the German 7th Army had transformed the terrain into a labyrinth of death. Hidden bunkers were dug into ridges, artillery pieces were zeroed in on every clearing, and mines littered the forest floor. The defenders, battle-hardened troops of the 275th and 353rd Infantry Divisions, were determined to make every tree a strong point. For the Americans, the objective seemed straightforward: to secure the Roer River and its two great dams, the Schwammenau and Urft. They had to push through the forest. Those dams controlled the water flow into the valley below. If the Germans released the water during a crossing attempt, entire divisions could be swept away. The plan, codenamed Operation Queen, called for the U.S. First Army under General Courtney Hodges to seize the Hürtgen, reach the Roer, and prepare for a drive on Cologne. It was meant to be swift, a few weeks of fighting at most. The 9th Infantry Division was among the first to move toward the dark wall of trees. To their left, the 3rd Armoured Division would support the push toward Düren, while to the south, the 28th Infantry Division prepared to advance through the villages of Vossenack and Schmidt. The soldiers were confident. They had marched through France, fought in Belgium, and believed they had seen the worst the war could offer. Many joked that the forest would be a brief detour on the road to the Rhine. Then came the rain. Cold, unending rain that turned the roads to mud and filled foxholes with water. Vehicles bogged down to their axles. Supply trucks sank on the narrow forest trails. The weather grounded Allied aircraft, robbing them of their greatest advantage, and as the soldiers entered the woods, the light vanished. The towering pines blocked the sky, swallowing sound and sense of direction. Maps became useless. Compasses spun wildly. Patrols lost their way and stumbled into ambushes just a few hundred yards from their starting point. The first contacts with the enemy were brief and bloody. German mortars fired from unseen positions. Tree bursts, shells detonating high in the canopy, rained wooden splinters sharper than shrapnel. American units used to open country fighting found themselves groping through fog and shadows, unable to see more than 20 yards ahead. Entire platoons vanished in the mist, cut apart by machine gun nests that opened fire and then fell silent again. Still, orders from higher command pressed them forward. The forest had to be cleared. The stakes were too high to pause. Division after division was committed to the fight, each believing they could succeed where the last had faltered. But in these early days, few grasped how deeply the forest itself was working against them. From the German perspective, the defence of the Hürtgen was more than tactical necessity. It was symbolic. This was German soil now. Behind them lay Cologne, the Ruhr, and the heartland of the Reich. General Erich Brandenberger, commanding the German 7th Army, understood that holding the forest would delay the Americans long enough for reinforcements to arrive. Even as his divisions were battered and depleted, he rotated fresh units through the line, keeping up the illusion of unbreakable resistance. For the Americans, each step into the forest felt like a descent into another world. The dense pines muffled artillery fire, making explosions sound distant even when they were near. Smoke clung to the damp air. Wounded men disappeared into the fog, calling out for medics who could not find them. Engineers tried to clear paths through minefields, but rain washed away their markers. It was a battle fought by small units, squads and platoons navigating by instinct, often unsure whether they were advancing or retreating. The early engagements around Germata and Wassenack revealed the grim reality. The 9th Infantry lost hundreds in the first days. The 28th Division, newly arrived from the bloodletting of Normandy, was ordered to push towards the town of Schmidt, perched on high ground near the Roer River. It was there commanders believed that the forest would finally open up into the valley beyond. But before reaching it, they would have to cross miles of ravines and wooded slopes crawling with defenders. By late October, the optimism that had marked the beginning of the campaign had vanished. Reports filtered back to headquarters of horrific losses, men disappearing into the trees, and units reduced to half strength within a week. Generals argued over whether to continue, yet no one wanted to admit defeat, not when the objective lay just a few miles ahead. The men on the ground gave the place a name, the Green Hell. They spoke of how the forest swallowed light and sound, how it seemed to breathe with the echoes of gunfire. They learned to fear the silence between shell bursts as much as the explosions themselves. Some said the trees were cursed, that they stood as silent sentinels for the dead of both sides. For those soldiers, the Hürtgen Forest was not a waypoint. It was a living nightmare. The enemy was everywhere and nowhere at once, and yet, as orders came down to continue the advance, there was little choice. The road to the Rhine ran straight through those dark woods. The men of the US First Army would march into them again and again, determined to finish what had begun. The first phase of the battle was far from over. The forest had only begun to claim its toll. What began as a strategic operation was already turning into a war within a war, one fought not only against an enemy army, but against the very earth itself. The Americans had entered the Hürtgen believing it was a simple obstacle. They would soon learn it was a graveyard waiting to be filled. The first men to step fully into the Hürtgen forest moved beneath a sky that vanished behind the trees. The canopy swallowed all light, and the air hung heavy with moisture and smoke. Every sound seemed to echo unnaturally. The metallic click of a rifle bolt, the thud of a shovel, the crunch of boots on soaked leaves. Those who entered the forest on the morning of September 19, 1944, would later say it felt less like marching to battle and more like walking into the earth itself. The 9th Infantry Division led the first major assault, moving through the northern edge of the forest near the towns of Schevenhütte and Germata. On paper, the plan was simple: push east, reach the Roer River Valley, and clear the path for armor to break through toward Cologne. In practice, the forest turned every order into confusion. Maps proved useless. Trails vanished into the trees, landmarks were obscured by fog, and the twisting ravines threw off all sense of direction. Radio signals faded in the thick canopy, forcing officers to rely on runners who often never came back. From the moment the first American battalions entered the woods, the Germans were waiting. They had spent weeks preparing an invisible fortress, interlocking fields of fire, machine guns concealed beneath log bunkers, mines scattered like seeds across every trail. Every ridge concealed a sniper, every clearing was pre-registered for artillery. The 275th Infantry Division, though battered and outnumbered, fought like a cornered animal. They understood the forest as only locals could, where to move unseen, where to dig, where the mist would hide them. For the men of the 9th Division, progress came in yards, not miles. Each small rise or bunker became a separate battle. Platoons advanced silently through the trees until the stillness shattered with gunfire. The forest magnified fear. The enemy was heard long before seen, and when contact came, it was sudden and devastating. German mortars fired from unseen positions. Shells exploded above the treetops, showering deadly splinters of steel and wood in all directions. Veterans from Normandy said they had never experienced such relentless chaos. The terrain broke apart to the American formations. Tanks and half-tracks could barely maneuver in the thick mud, leaving infantrymen exposed and alone. Supply lines stretched dangerously thin, with ammunition carried forward by hand or mule. Wounded men were dragged through the undergrowth on improvised stretchers, their moans swallowed by the wind. Every footstep risked a mine, every fallen tree might conceal a wire. By the second week, the forest had begun to consume entire companies. The 60th Infantry Regiment reported that some units had been reduced to a third of their strength. Commanders tried to rotate exhausted men, but replacements arriving from the rear fared little better. The forest disoriented them. Even veterans became lost within minutes. A squad sent to flank an enemy bunker often reappeared hours later from the wrong direction, pale and shaking. In one engagement near Germata, a platoon of the 39th Infantry advanced into a fog-covered ravine. The Germans, concealed on the ridge above, waited until the Americans were deep in the kill zone before opening fire. Within moments, the ravine became a trap. Bullets cutting through branches, machine guns raking the ground, mortars bursting overhead. Survivors clawed their way back up the slope, pulling the wounded behind them, only to find that their lines had already shifted. That ravine would later be marked on division maps simply as Dead Man's Hollow. Higher up the chain of command, the frustration grew. General Courtney Hodges and his corps commanders still believed the forest could be taken quickly, with persistence and fresh troops. Orders came down for renewed assaults, each described as the final push. The 28th Infantry Division, newly arrived and still recovering from its ordeal in France, was told to take over where the 9th had stalled. The men of the 28th, wearing their red keystone insignia, entered the Hürtgen in early November, unaware that the units before them had already been broken by the same ground they now faced. They marched past burned-out tanks and shattered trees that bore the marks of thousands of shell bursts. Everywhere there were signs of desperate combat, rifles half buried in the mud, helmets hanging from branches, boots sticking out of collapsed foxholes. The air smelled of cordite and damp earth. Officers briefed their men on objectives that were measured in ridgelines rather than towns. The names of places like Vossenack and Schmidt would soon become synonymous with tragedy. In the opening days of their advance, the 28th Division attacked along a narrow ridge towards the village of Schmidt, believed to be the key to the Roer River crossings. The initial progress seemed promising. By November the 3rd, elements of the 112th Infantry Regiment had actually reached the outskirts of the town. From their positions, they could see the valley below, the first open terrain since entering the forest. Yet victory was a mirage. The Germans had held back their reserves precisely for this moment. As dusk fell, counterattacks crashed against the thin American line. The 116th Panzer Division, supported by tanks and assault guns, rolled forward through the smoke. Communication lines had been severed, artillery support failed to reach the front in time. In the confusion, American positions were overrun one by one. By dawn, Schmidt was back in German hands. Survivors of the 112th stumbled back through the forest, many without weapons, others leading prisoners, their own comrades wounded too badly to walk. What followed was chaos. Units became entangled, command posts were overrun, and entire companies vanished. The forest had devoured them. The 28th Division's attack collapsed within days, leaving the survivors digging in around Vossenac under ceaseless bombardment. Rain turned to sleet. Foxholes filled with icy water. Men who had survived the first assaults now faced starvation and exhaustion. Ammunition was scarce, food nearly gone. Messages from headquarters offered encouragement, but no relief. The Germans exploited every advantage. They moved unseen between trees, their machine guns firing short, precise bursts. Mortar teams changed positions constantly, making counterfire nearly impossible. Even their supply lines functioned better. Narrow forest trails allowed them to move ammunition under cover of night. American soldiers soon realized that each attack only fed more lives into the forest. By mid-November, the cost was staggering. Some regiments reported casualty rates of over 50%. Commanders began to question whether the operation was even necessary, yet the orders remained unchanged. Keep advancing, hold ground gained at any cost, prepare for another push toward the Roer dams. Letters home from the front revealed the soldiers' despair. "It's a forest made for the devil," one private wrote. "You don't see the enemy, you only see trees, and the trees are full of death." Another described the constant dread of tree bursts, shells exploding in the branches above. "The sound is like tearing cloth," he said, "and then the rain of splinters comes down. You pray the next one doesn't have your name on it." Amid this misery, acts of heroism went unnoticed. Medics crawled through shell fire to drag wounded men to cover. Artillery observers climbed shattered trunks to call down barrages on positions only a few hundred yards away. Machine gunners stood their ground until their barrels glowed red. The forest absorbed every story, offering no glory, only survival. By the time the first snows began to fall, the Americans had barely advanced a mile deeper into the woods. The price in blood was immense. Commanders insisted that the enemy was weakening, that one more coordinated effort would finally break the line. Few on the ground believed it anymore. The forest had become a world of its own, a place where time lost meaning, where each dawn felt the same as the last, and where every victory was measured in meters. The first forays into the Hürtgen had revealed what lay ahead. This was no temporary obstacle. It was a battlefield designed by nature and perfected by man. The Americans had come expecting to clear a flank. Instead, they found themselves trapped in a campaign that seemed to have no end. As the battered divisions withdrew to reorganize, the quiet returned for a moment. Smoke drifted between the blackened trunks. The silence felt wrong, as if the forest were holding its breath. The next phase was coming, a deeper, bloodier push that would test every ounce of endurance the American army possessed. The Hürtgen Forest had drawn them in. It would not let go easily. By late November 1944, the American campaign inside the Hürtgen Forest had become a siege of endurance. The forest seemed alive, breathing in smoke and exhaling despair. Each ridge was soaked with rain and blood. Each narrow trail was a trap. For the men still pushing forward, the war had shrunk to a few hundred yards of tangled branches, a landscape that offered no horizon, no promise of relief. When the 4th Infantry Division rotated in to take over from the shattered 28th, many believed the worst was behind them. New officers spoke of momentum, of reorganizing and finally breaking the line. Trucks brought in supplies, artillery maps were drawn up again, and headquarters issued fresh timetables for success. The optimism lasted only hours. As soon as the new regiments advanced, the forest swallowed them like the rest. The 22nd Infantry Regiment led the next assault. Veterans called it the walk into nowhere. The men stepped off before dawn, moving through terrain so soaked that each boot sank inches into the mud. The first wave advanced in silence, every weapon slick with moisture. Then came the opening salvo, a thunderclap of German artillery that shredded the tree line and threw whole platoons to the ground. The explosions detonated high in the branches, bursting in flashes of orange and white. Splinters from the pines tore through helmets and flesh alike. Those who survived the initial blast kept moving, though no one could see farther than a few feet ahead. Inside the forest, direction was a myth. Officers' compasses spun erratically from iron buried in the earth. Trails shifted under the rain. Every landmark was a repetition of the last, a fallen log, a crater, a pile of shattered trunks. Even time lost shape. Dawn and dusk bled into each other under the heavy canopy, and men fought for days without realizing the calendar had turned. Small units operated almost entirely on their own. Squads of 10 or 12 moved forward, vanished into the trees, and rarely returned intact. The German defenders, remnants of the 275th and 344th Divisions, fought from dugouts, reinforced with logs several feet thick. They moved through communication trenches invisible to the Americans, striking from flanks that seemed impossible to reach. Machine guns raked the ground in bursts, so controlled that each shot sounded deliberate, as if the forest itself were choosing who lived and who died. Every hill and hollow became a battleground with its own story. One ridge near the town of Grosshau was nicknamed Suicide Hill, after 3 successive companies were cut down trying to reach its crest. Artillery fire carved craters so deep that men hid in them like burrows, waiting for a lull to crawl a few meters forward. At night, the forest echoed with the metallic clatter of shovels as foxholes were dug into frozen earth. The wounded moaned through the darkness until their voices faded, blending into the rustle of rain through pine needles. The 22nd Regiment's ordeal lasted 18 days. In that time, its casualty lists tripled and leadership evaporated. Battalion commanders fell within hours of each other. Replacements arrived straight from depots in France and were thrust into combat without maps or context, following trails lined with corpses. Veterans from earlier fights guided them silently, their faces hollow, their uniforms stained the same grey-brown colour as the ground. One after another, villages along the forest edge, Hürtgen, Kleinhau and Grosshau, became synonymous with annihilation. Each represented a few ruined houses, a church tower shattered by artillery, and streets filled with the remnants of 2 armies fighting at point-blank range. Civilians who had remained in their basements emerged dazed, only to find their homes reduced to smouldering ruins. For the soldiers, these villages were milestones in exhaustion. Progress was measured not by victory, but by the dwindling of those still standing. The forest had become so thick with smoke that even air support was useless. Pilots reported seeing nothing but a grey carpet of mist and branches. Tanks sank into the mud or were blown apart by mines before firing a shot. Engineers struggled to cut new supply paths, their bulldozers bogging down in the rain. Artillery batteries miles behind the lines hurled shells blindly, guided only by coordinates whispered over crackling radios. The Germans endured their own nightmare. Many were veterans of the Eastern Front, accustomed to bitter cold and endless attrition. They too froze in their bunkers, hungry and sleepless, surrounded by the corpses of their comrades. Yet they held. Their discipline and familiarity with the terrain gave them the advantage that no amount of American firepower could erase. Even as the US First Army poured more divisions into the cauldron, the line refused to break. Amid the chaos, the 8th Infantry Division joined the battle, relieving fragments of the 4th. The transition offered no respite. Patrols moved through areas already fought over multiple times, each hill scarred by previous assaults. The ground was churned into a morass of roots, mud, and bone. Trees had been stripped of bark by shrapnel, their trunks standing like charred pillars in a ruined cathedral. Veterans began calling the forest the Grinder. It was a fitting name. Everything that entered came out changed, if it came out at all. In letters intercepted later, German soldiers described the Americans as ghosts who kept coming no matter how many were cut down. Yet the illusion of progress was deceiving. The US front line often bent backward or looped around itself. Entire companies fought isolated, unaware that they were surrounded. Medics performed surgery under ponchos, using trench knives as scalpels. Chaplains moved between foxholes to give last rites in whispers, their voices trembling in the cold. By December, snow began to fall through the blackened canopy. Each flake landed silently on helmets and rifles, dissolving into droplets that slid down faces streaked with grime. The men fought on with frozen hands, their weapons jamming, their rations frozen solid. The silence between shell bursts grew longer, more haunting. In those moments, soldiers swore they could hear the forest whispering, the creak of trees swaying under the weight of snow, the drip of water from shattered branches, the soft crunch of unseen footsteps. For those who survived long enough to leave the front lines, the memory of the Hürtgen clung like the smell of smoke. Many never spoke of it again. In field hospitals beyond the forest, nurses described men staring blankly for hours, unable to answer when asked their names. Commanders tried to make sense of the cost. Thousands of casualties for a few thousand yards gained. The maps back at headquarters showed a jagged front that barely moved, yet orders continued to insist that the objective, the Roer River and its dams, remained vital. War correspondents who visited the rear described the campaign as an invisible battle. Unlike Normandy or the Ardennes, there were no dramatic breakthroughs or clear victories to report. Just rain, trees, and endless loss. Ernest Hemingway, who witnessed the fighting, compared it to a vision from the First World War, Passchendaele reborn among the pines. For once, the frontline soldiers agreed with the journalists. The forest had turned the modern war of mechanized armies into a primitive contest of will. By the end of December, the 22nd and 8th Infantry Divisions had finally secured a narrow corridor leading out of the forest toward the village of Grossau. It was hailed as a success, though few who fought there saw it that way. Of the 22nd Regiment's original 6,000 men, fewer than 1,000 were left fit for combat. The rest were dead, wounded, or missing. Yet the line held, and the battered survivors were ordered to prepare for the next phase, the final drive towards the Roer dams. Behind them, the forest stood silent once more. Smoke drifted through the charred trunks, and the snow covered the bodies lying unburied beneath shattered branches. The Hürtgen had claimed more lives than many entire campaigns, yet it still waited, vast and indifferent, for the next wave to come. The Americans had entered believing they could break the enemy's will. Instead, the forest had tested their own. The battle was far from over. Deeper in the woods, the enemy still held the high ground, and winter was closing in with merciless speed. What had begun as a tactical necessity had become something darker, a struggle for survival inside a world stripped of reason. The men who walked out of the Hürtgen would carry its silence with them forever. By December 1944, the Hürtgen forest had become a frozen labyrinth. The trees that once hid the enemy now bent under the weight of snow, their branches cracking in the still air like rifle shots. Smoke from burned-out villages drifted between the trunks, mixing with mist that refused to lift even in daylight. The landscape, already stripped of colour, turned to a palette of grey, white, and the deep brown of churned mud. Those who remained in the line were half-starved, sleep-deprived, and carrying the weight of weeks of unending combat. The latest units to enter the forest were the 83rd and 8th Infantry Divisions, thrown into what senior commanders still called limited operations. On paper, the orders seemed simple: consolidate gains, secure the roads near Großhau and Hürtgen, and prepare for the next phase toward the Roer River. In reality, it meant surviving another month in the most inhospitable battlefield on German soil. The cold struck harder than the shells. Men wrapped themselves in blankets stiff with frost, their breath freezing into crystals on the edges of their helmets. At night, foxholes filled with icy water, and those who fell asleep risked never waking. Fires were forbidden for fear of revealing positions, so rations were eaten cold, often frozen solid. Coffee came as slush, and rifles froze unless oiled constantly. Gloves were scarce, boots were soaked through, and frostbite spread faster than any wound. In the upper valleys near the Karl Trail, American supply lines faltered again. Trucks sank axle-deep in mud that froze by night and thawed by midday, creating a cycle of chaos that destroyed entire convoys. Engineers worked day and night to cut fresh tracks through the forest, laying logs into the ground to support vehicles. The sound of chainsaws and bulldozers echoed faintly through the mist, a mechanical hum against the eerie silence of the woods. Many of those engineers never made it out alive. The Germans had mined every potential road, and sniper fire waited for anyone exposed for too long. German artillery was relentless. The defenders, now part of the reorganized 74th Corps, had perfected the rhythm of the forest war. They struck just before dawn, when American units were still huddled in their holes, then withdrew into the fog. Shells landed without warning, timed to catch men at the moment they lifted their heads. Every explosion brought the same sickening combination of splintering trees and muffled cries. There were no clear front lines anymore, only scattered strong points clinging to ridges and trails. The psychological toll deepened. Veterans described the feeling as a slow drowning, a helpless slide into exhaustion and disbelief. Officers tried to maintain discipline, but even their confidence cracked in the face of the endless attrition. Messages from higher command were filled with optimism. Victory is near, keep pressing forward. To those in the forest, those words felt distant, written from a world that no longer existed. The medics worked around the clock in makeshift aid stations hidden behind ridges. They cut away frozen uniforms, packed wounds with morphine-soaked bandages, and sent the worst cases back down the treacherous trails. Ambulances rarely made it to the front. Many broke down or were destroyed by shell fire. Casualties piled up faster than they could be evacuated. Some of the wounded begged to be left behind, their voices hoarse, eyes glazed with fever. The aid stations themselves were under constant bombardment, wooden beams shuddering as shells burst nearby, ceiling lights swinging wildly as doctors stitched by the flicker of kerosene lamps. The forest itself fought every step of the way. The ground heaved under the bombardments, creating a landscape of craters that filled with freezing water. The snow, stained black and red, froze into sheets that made footing treacherous. Even the air seemed alive with menace, heavy, damp, and filled with the constant hiss of distant artillery. Every breath carried the taste of cordite and decay. The men joked grimly that the Hürtgen was trying to kill them faster than the Germans ever could. For the defenders, survival was just as harsh. German soldiers, huddled in bunkers, dug deep into the slopes, eating turnips and black bread, their supplies dwindling as the snow piled higher. The difference was that they were home. Their villages lay only a few miles behind them, their families somewhere beyond the next ridge. They fought with the desperation of those who had nowhere left to retreat. Reinforcements were scarce, but their will to resist remained unbroken. On December 9th, the 8th Infantry Division began its push toward the Brandenburg-Bergstein Ridge, an objective that promised dominance over the northern approaches. The attack began before dawn, shrouded in fog so thick that visibility dropped to less than 10 yards. Men advanced, crouched, rifles cradled to their chests, the only sound the squelch of mud beneath their boots. Within minutes, mortar rounds fell among them, scattering formations and setting the trees ablaze. Flames licked up the trunks, casting ghostly shadows across the snow. Officers shouted to rally their men, but the words dissolved into the storm of gunfire. It took 3 days of continuous fighting to reach the ridge, and when it was finally secured, it looked nothing like a victory. The summit was a wasteland, bodies half buried under snow, branches hanging in tatters, the ground still trembling under distant shelling. The survivors dug in, knowing they would have to hold this ground against the inevitable counterattack. The German response came almost immediately. Under cover of a blizzard, small assault teams crept up the slopes, tossing grenades into foxholes and vanishing again. By morning, the Americans were still there, but their numbers were fewer. In the villages below, artillery duels continued day and night. The thunder never stopped. Each blast rolled through the forest like a heartbeat, shaking the ground and sending cascades of snow from the branches. Civilians who had refused to flee sheltered in cellars, praying the shells would pass them by. To the soldiers, those empty houses became both refuge and trap, one moment offering cover, the next collapsing under a direct hit. By mid-December, the first reports of German troop movements beyond the forest began to reach headquarters. No one understood their purpose. Scouts saw armored columns heading east, but assumed they were withdrawing. In truth, those movements were the early stages of a new offensive building in the Ardennes. While the Hürtgen battle raged on, the Wehrmacht was preparing its final gamble, a counterattack that would soon shock the entire front. For the moment, though, the forest remained the center of the soldiers' world. The weather worsened, bringing sleet that froze on rifles and made the ground glitter like glass. Patrols went out at dusk, silent figures blending into the snow, searching for enemy lines that were often less than 100 yards away. Every encounter was brutal and brief. Bayonets in the dark, grenades hurled blind, the sharp crack of rifles echoing through the trees. As Christmas approached, there was no sign of peace. Field chaplains held short services in half-collapsed shelters, their voices trembling through the cold. Soldiers listened, some with heads bowed, others staring into the fireless dark. Packages from home arrived frozen solid. Letters came smudged and unreadable. The forest was still hungry, and it would have its fill before the end. On the final days before the year turned, the snow deepened once more, muffling the sounds of battle. Units rotated out in fragments, a dozen men where there had once been 100. Those who left carried little with them. A pack of cigarettes, a tattered photo, a numbness that words could not describe. Behind them, the forest remained unchanged, indifferent to the thousands who had passed through its shadows. The campaign was far from complete, yet those still inside the Hürtgen began to sense a change in the wind. Something vast was shifting beyond the horizon, something that would soon eclipse the nightmare they had endured. But for now, in the endless cold of December, the men of the First Army held their ground, frozen in a landscape that seemed determined to erase them. As the final weeks of 1944 approached, the Hürtgen Forest was no longer a battlefield. It was a scar across the Western Front. The snow-covered ridges hid the truth from the maps in headquarters. Entire battalions reduced to fragments, roads erased by shell fire, and men surviving by instinct more than command. Each tree bore the marks of violence, bark shredded by shrapnel, branches hanging like broken bones. The forest had become a place where victory no longer looked like triumph, only endurance. Behind the front lines, generals studied their charts under the dim glow of lanterns. The objective had never changed: the Roer River dams. Those great concrete walls held back millions of tons of water. If the Germans destroyed them, the flood would surge across the valley and drown any attempt to cross the river. To the planners of the First Army, this was the key to unlocking the road to the Rhine. Yet from the perspective of the soldiers freezing in foxholes, the dams might as well have been on another planet. The order for the next push came down on December the 10th. The battered divisions that had survived the last phase were told to reorganize and prepare to move east once again. The 78th Infantry Division, fresh from training grounds in England, arrived to take over part of the line. Their arrival brought a flicker of hope among the exhausted survivors, but even before their first patrols reached the front, the veterans warned them quietly: "The forest eats everything." The 78th would soon learn the truth. Their task was to seize the approach routes toward the Urft and Schwammenau dams. The terrain ahead was deceptive, open in places, but hemmed in by more ridges and deep-cut ravines. German artillery overlooked every path, and the defenders were masters at concealing positions among the ruins. Even with weeks of bombardment, few of those strong points were ever truly destroyed. Meanwhile, to the north, the city of Aachen lay in ruins. It had been the first German city captured by the Allies, but the victory had come at a staggering cost. Streets were reduced to rubble, and every basement served as a temporary grave. The lesson of Aachen, that every inch of Germany would be fought over, was now playing out again on a scale the Americans hadn't anticipated. From Aachen to the Hürtgen, the land itself seemed to conspire against them. As the 78th moved forward, they found themselves retracing ground already soaked with blood. The forest seemed endless, and every mile brought the same oppressive silence before the next eruption of shells. Engineers cleared the trails by hand, removing mines one by one under the watch of German snipers hidden in the branches. The cold made every sound sharper: the metallic click of a rifle safety, the crunch of boots on ice, the hollow echo of distant artillery. The Germans had not abandoned the fight. Their new commander in the sector, General Friedrich Koechling, directed the defense with ruthless precision. His orders were clear: hold the dams at all costs, delay the Americans long enough for the coming counteroffensive to take shape. To the south, reserves were already gathering in secrecy, preparing for an operation that would soon shake the entire Western Front. None of the Allied officers studying their maps inside Hürtgen's edge could yet see it coming. For the men of the 78th, the early days of December were a blur of movement and confusion. Snow fell in sheets, blinding visibility. Radio communication was unreliable, and coordinates often led patrols straight into ambushes. The Germans had learned the American habits. When they paused for resupply, the mortars followed. When they advanced, the artillery walked ahead of them, forcing every step into cover. The forest offered no safe place to rest. Further north, the remnants of the 8th Division were ordered to push towards the town of Bergstein, perched on a ridge overlooking the Roer Valley. It was the last significant high ground before the dams themselves. The fight for Bergstein became one of the most brutal clashes of the entire campaign. American artillery pounded the hill for hours before the infantry advanced, but the defenders held on, firing from the ruins of farmhouses and stone cellars. When the Americans finally stormed the ridge, the smoke was so thick that men fought by the flashes of their rifles. By nightfall, the town was in American hands, barely. Only fragments of companies remained. The next morning, German counterattacks came roaring out of the mist. Panzer units, long believed destroyed, appeared again, their engines echoing through the valley. Infantry followed in waves, shouting through the snowstorm. For 2 days, the ridge changed hands again and again. When the fighting finally subsided, Bergstein was a graveyard. The surviving Americans called it Bloody Hill. Commanders back at headquarters marked it as secured. Each success in the forest seemed hollow. For every ridge taken, another line of defense emerged beyond it. Reports flowed back of entire regiments cut down before reaching the open ground near the Roer. Some officers began to question whether the campaign had already achieved its strategic purpose. After all, the Germans had been pinned down for months, their divisions tied up and unable to reinforce elsewhere. Yet the obsession with the dams persisted. Commanders feared that if they left the structures intact in enemy hands, the spring thaw would unleash chaos. At the same time, signs of something larger began to surface. Prisoners captured in the line spoke of troop movements to the east, of armored divisions regrouping, of new units with fresh insignia passing through the villages of Monschau and Prüm. Allied intelligence dismissed much of it as rumor. The weather was worsening, and the Germans, it was assumed, lacked the strength to launch a major offensive. The reality was far different. By mid-December, the 78th Division was exhausted. They had gained ground, but at immense cost. The front was stretched thin, with small outposts scattered through the snow. Then, on the morning of December the 16th, a low rumble echoed through the forest, distant at first, then growing into a rolling thunder. It wasn't the usual pattern of artillery. It came from the south, deep and continuous, like the sound of the earth itself tearing open. Moments later, reports began flooding in. The Germans had launched a massive counter-offensive through the Ardennes. The shock spread instantly. The very divisions that had bled themselves in the Hürtgen were now ordered to hold the line, while reinforcements rushed to meet the new threat. Trucks and tanks roared westward along the same roads the men had fought months to secure. The forest, already filled with wreckage, became a crossroads of retreating convoys and fresh units moving toward the unknown. The Hürtgen campaign, once considered the center of the Allied effort, was suddenly overshadowed. For the soldiers still in the field, the shift was surreal. Orders came to dig in and defend, though many wondered what there was left to defend. The dams remained in German hands, but the focus had shifted entirely. The Ardennes was on fire, and the roar of the new battle rolled across the winter air like a storm. By Christmas, snow covered everything. The guns fell silent for brief moments, interrupted by the distant rumble from the south. The Hürtgen line froze into stillness. Men stared across no man's land at enemy positions that were just as quiet. It was as if both sides were catching their breath before the next act of the war. In the months that followed, historians would question the purpose of the entire operation. The forest had yielded little of strategic value. The dams were eventually captured early in 1945, after the main German forces had already been broken in the Ardennes. Yet the cost had been staggering. Tens of thousands of American casualties, countless wounded, and an enemy who had achieved what he wanted most, time. The Hürtgen campaign had been intended as a step toward the Rhine. Instead, it became a warning. The battle had consumed divisions, drained morale, and revealed that even an army on the verge of victory could bleed itself dry through stubbornness and misjudgment. The forest had taken more than ground. It had taken the illusion of easy triumph. The snow would melt in spring, revealing what had been hidden beneath: the debris of helmets, the bones of the fallen, and the rusted remains of weapons left where they dropped. For those who survived, the memory of the Hürtgen was not of glory or conquest, but of endurance amid futility. The war in the West was far from over. Ahead lay the Rhine, the Ruhr, and the final push into the heart of Germany. Yet every soldier who stepped out of the forest carried with him a lesson written in the mud and snow, that even victory can come dressed as defeat. When the guns finally fell silent over the Hürtgen in early 1945, the forest stood as a monument to exhaustion. The wind moved through the skeletal branches with a sound like whispering voices, carrying with it the faint scent of cordite and decay. The snow still lay deep across the ravines, covering the wreckage of tanks and artillery pieces, their iron shapes half buried and rimed with frost. The silence that followed the final barrage was not peace. It was the heavy pause that comes after too much suffering. For the survivors of the US First Army, the withdrawal from the forest felt nothing like victory. There was no parade ground triumph, no cheering columns or polished boots. The men who limped out of those woods looked hollow, their eyes dulled by weeks of hunger, fear, and cold. Some refused to speak of what they had seen. Others stared at the landscape behind them, the endless maze of trees and the faint haze of smoke still rising from the distance, as if leaving behind a piece of themselves they could never reclaim. In total, the Hürtgen campaign had lasted longer than the Normandy invasion and inflicted nearly as many casualties. More than 33,000 Americans were killed or wounded, a figure that stunned the high command when the final reports reached Eisenhower's headquarters. German losses were also severe, estimated at over 28,000, though the defenders had achieved what their generals had intended all along. They had delayed the Allies for months, buying time for the counter-offensive that became the Battle of the Bulge. The forest, in its indifferent way, had served the Reich one last time. When the front shifted eastward toward the Rhine, the Hürtgen sector was left behind in a kind of limbo. Engineers moved through in silence, clearing mines and burying the dead. Graves registration units marked sites with wooden crosses, hundreds of them lined in neat rows where once stood shattered trees. The process went on for weeks. Even as the war thundered forward toward Cologne and the Ruhr, the forest clung to its secrets. Each thaw revealed another trench, another crater filled with helmets and frozen boots. War correspondents who returned to the area in February described the scene in tones of disbelief. Charles B. MacDonald, an officer-turned-historian who had fought there, called it a place of ghosts. He walked the same trails where his company had fought and found the ground unchanged, save for the silence. The trees were blackened, the soil churned to mud, and everywhere there were fragments of lives, a rusted canteen, a torn photograph, a child's toy from one of the abandoned German villages. To stand there was to feel the weight of all the men who had vanished beneath those branches. For the local civilians who emerged after the fighting, the forest was unrecognizable. Villages like Vossenack, Schmidt, and Hürtgen itself were reduced to rubble, their churches flattened, their fields cratered beyond use. Survivors returned to find little more than chimneys rising from the snow. They rebuilt as best they could, often using timber from the same trees that had witnessed the carnage. For years after the war, farmers would unearth unexploded shells while ploughing or stumble across bones in the thawing spring earth. The land had become a graveyard that refused to rest. Back in the United States, the name Hürtgen barely appeared in newspapers. The timing of the campaign's end coincided with the dramatic headlines from the Ardennes and the liberation of Paris months before. Compared to those grand events, the forest seemed small, obscure, and inconclusive. The generals had little to celebrate, and so the story faded from the public eye. Families of the fallen received telegrams that spoke of heroic action in Germany without mention of the suffocating forest where so many had perished. For years afterward, the battle remained overshadowed, a victory without glory, a wound without recognition. Yet among the veterans, the memory endured like a scar that never healed. Those who fought there spoke of the place in hushed tones, using the same phrase again and again, the green hell. In reunions and letters, they described how the forest had stripped away every illusion of war, the clean lines of maps, the grand strategies, the talk of liberation. In Hürtgen, everything had been reduced to the elemental: cold, hunger, fear, and survival. Medals were awarded, but few of those who received them ever felt like heroes. Historians would later debate the purpose of the campaign. Some called it a blunder, arguing that the forest could have been bypassed entirely. Others defended the decision, insisting that the threat of the Roer River dams justified the sacrifice. Still, when the war was over and the full scale of the losses became clear, even senior commanders struggled to justify what had been gained. The dams were eventually captured in February 1945, months after the worst fighting, by units who met little resistance. The water was released, flooding the valley for days, but by then the Allied bridgeheads had already been secured elsewhere. The victory at Hürtgen, if it could be called one, had come too late to matter. In Germany, the forest became part of collective memory in a different way. The local people rebuilt their homes, and in time, nature began to reclaim the ground. New growth sprouted among the craters, and birds returned to nest in the hollowed trees. Yet even decades later, the scars remained visible. Visitors walking through the Hürtgen today still find the remnants of bunkers hidden under moss, the faint outlines of trenches snaking through the soil. The wind that passes through the pines carries an uncanny quiet, as if the forest still remembers. In the years that followed, memorials were raised. Simple stone markers appeared at crossroads and village squares, dedicated to those who fought on both sides. American and German veterans occasionally returned together, walking the same paths where they had once tried to kill each other. Many were old men by then, their steps slow, their faces lined with time. Some brought small tokens, a unit patch, a flag, or a photograph, and left them on the ground, a gesture of reconciliation where once there had been only destruction. For the US Army, the lessons of the Hürtgen were studied and written into manuals. Commanders cited it as a warning against fighting terrain rather than the enemy. The experience showed how technology and firepower could be rendered useless by nature and poor planning. In classrooms and military academies, maps of the battle became teaching tools dissected with precision. Yet in those neat diagrams, something essential was lost: the human weight of it all, the cold mornings and sleepless nights, the men who disappeared into the mist and were never found. By the time spring arrived in 1945, the forest had begun to heal. Melting snow revealed a sea of rusted helmets, empty shell casings, and broken rifles. The bodies were gathered, the graves marked, and the surviving trees sprouted new shoots. The war moved on toward Berlin, and soon after it ended altogether. But for those who had walked beneath the dark canopy of the Hürtgen, peace did not come easily. Many carried the forest with them, in their nightmares, in the ringing in their ears, in the weight of memories that refused to fade. In the decades since, historians have called the Hürtgen Forest battle one of the costliest and least understood campaigns of the Second World War. Its fields and slopes remain quiet now, carpeted with moss and pine needles, the air heavy with the scent of damp earth. Yet for those who know where to look, the evidence endures: a dented helmet half buried in mud, the jagged corner of a bunker, the faint outline of an old trench. The forest remembers what men would rather forget. Today, visitors walk the marked trails that trace the old front lines. The wind moves through the branches just as it did in that terrible winter, and the ground still holds the echoes of battle, faint, almost imperceptible, like the distant hum of history itself. The Hürtgen stands as both memorial and warning, a place where courage and futility intertwined, where soldiers on both sides discovered the limits of endurance. The war would march on beyond the forest, but its story ended there, in silence, beneath the same trees that had once turned daylight into twilight and hope into memory. The Hürtgen's legacy endures, whispered by the wind through the pines, a reminder that even the strongest armies can lose themselves in the heart of the woods.